Today we're going to look at Chapter 8, Learning. This is in the AP Psychology textbook by David Myers, so it's the 8th edition. So remember what we're doing here is we're just looking at an outline of what we're going to cover. And in this unit, you have to know classical and operant conditioning, and you need to know examples for each of these. So if you guys remember the worksheet that I gave you where you had to identify whether it was classical or operant learning, you should go ahead and get that worksheet back out so that you can look at it. Learning is anything that is a relatively permanent change in a person or an organism's behavior due to experience. So experience and learning go hand in hand. You need to do something, and if whatever it is the experience is, if it's something that's going to result in a pretty permanent change in your behavior, then that would be learning. So how do we learn? We learn through association, which is what I've been telling you all year, is what you need to do is you need to associate psychology with your everyday life. And this is true for all your subjects. You know, the harder the subject is, the more you need to try and make some sort of association, some sort of connection to the material. So our minds connect things, and our minds just naturally do it. So this law of association is something that you just need to do for all your subjects. So when we look at this snail, stimulus, right? So learning to associate one stimulus with another. If the snail gets splashed on its tail, there's a little shock that occurs. So it's learning splash equals shock, splash equals shock, stimulus, learning. Here are some other stimulus learning. So learning to associate one stimulus with another. If you see lightning and then you have thunder. So after lightning and thunder, what you're going to start to do is you're going to start associate these things. So every time you see lightning, you might actually start to kind of clench up because you know that there's going to be the thunder following it. And that's that stimulus learning. So response consequence learning. So learning to associate a response with a consequence. So here the seal is balancing the ball on his nose. He does this. His trainer gives him a reward, the fish. And now every time he balances the ball on his nose, he's going to get the fish, and it strengthens the behavior. So this is how like dog training and everything kind of works like that. It's the same thing with how we're trained on vending machines. So learning to associate a response with a consequence. You put your money in, you get your candy bar. So every time you put your money in, you expect the candy bar as a reward or as a consequence of the behavior. So when we look at classical conditioning, we need to look at this guy called Pavlov. And Pavlov is just an important guy with learning. And we'll look at Skinner and we'll look at Bandura in this unit. But you need to know Pavlov. So Pavlov is going to look at dogs, and he's going to look at can he make a dog salivate? Can he make the dog drool? So what he does is before the conditioning, before he's actually doing this food, the unconditioned stimulus, the US, is going to produce the dog's salivation. So the dog's going to drool. The dog sees food, the dog drools. And this is an unconditioned response. The dog's not been taught this. This is just the natural reaction. Now, then what Pavlov is going to do is he's going to bring in a bell. So he brings in a bell, this tone, and that's neutral. The dog doesn't do anything to it. He's probably just looking at Pavlov, okay, crazy guy. So this is what the setup of the experiment is. Now, when the experiment starts to continue, this is the conditioning. Conditioning is the acquisition of learning. So the neutral stimulus, that tone, that bell, he'd ring it. Then he'd show the unconditioned stimulus, the food, and he would pair the tone and the food. He paired them together. And of course, the dog would drool. And this was an unconditioned response. It's unconditioned because it hasn't been learned yet. So you'd ring the bell, show the food at the same time, and then the dog drooled. Ring bell, food, dog drooled. He kept repeating this. So after conditioning, the neutral stimulus, the bell ringing, take away that food, the dog, every time he heard the bell ringing, he had learned to associate it with the actual food. And so now the dog has learned to actually respond. Bell rings, he starts to drool. Now that every time he hears that bell ringing, it's a conditioned response. The conditioned response is going to be him drooling. So you can make something that's perfectly neutral into something that has meaning for people. This is like the school bells ringing for you guys. You know, school bells ringing when you're little, it has no meaning. But now school bells ringing as you're in high school has meaning. And every bell has a different meaning. You know, the 8:20 bell is, you know, oh, start of the horrible day. Then the 3:30 bell is freedom. And then, you know, the lunch bells all mean something different to you as well. So we've conditioned you to learn to associate those bells with dreading the day or freedom or whatever the bell means to you. So acquisition is in the initial stages in classical conditioning in which an association between a neutral stimulus and an unconditioned stimulus takes place. This is when you're trying to get your subject to actually learn the behavior. So in most cases, for conditioning to occur, the neutral stimulus needs to come before the unconditioned stimulus. So that bell had to come before the unconditioned stimulus. Okay. Now the time in between the two stimuli should be about half a second. So it needs to be pretty quick. It needs to be almost immediately. So if we look at here with acquisition, so the conditioned stimulus needs to come half a second before the unconditioned stimulus for acquisition to occur. So the unconditioned stimulus, the passionate kiss, and the unconditioned response is sexual arousal. So you kiss, you know, it's leading up, okay? Now, let's throw in onion breath. So conditioned stimulus, onion breath, like everybody knows onion breath is repulsive. The unconditioned stimulus, the passionate kiss, is going to lead to an unconditioned response of sexual behavior. So I'm putting in this conditioned stimulus. People hate it, onion breath, but now I'm putting it in with an unconditioned stimulus like passionate kiss. And I get this unconditioned response called sexual arousal. Now, every time you smell onion breath, see this is conditioned stimulus, now I've conditioned onion breath to have the conditioned response of sexual arousal. So you compare two things, even though they have nothing in common, you compare them through conditioning, and you might get a result like this. You might get onion breath and sexual arousal, two things that really don't go along. Now, extinction occurs when you actually forget. Okay, so when the unconditioned stimulus, the food, does not follow the conditioned stimulus, that tone, your conditioned response, salivation, begins to decrease and eventually causes extinction. Eventually, the dog will forget that he is supposed to drool. And now remember, this is not, he does not think, ooh, I better start drooling. What starts to happen is his body just stops doing it. It's the same thing with school. Eventually, the bells in high school are going to have no meaning to you when you go to college, and then some of you guys come back to high school to come visit your high school teachers. You hear those bells, they have no meaning to you anymore. That's extinction. So eventually, not having that unconditioned stimulus following the conditioned stimulus, you're going to have the conditioned response going away. Sometimes, however, spontaneous recovery does occur. So after a rest period, an extinguished conditioned response to salivation spontaneously recovers. But if the conditioned stimulus, the tone, persists alone, the conditioned response can become extinct again. So you can see behaviors reoccurring. So let's say you do come back to high school after you are in college, and you hear the bells and you start actually acting just like a high school student again. That would be spontaneous recovery. So stimulus generalization. So this is the tendency to respond to stimuli that's similar to the conditioned stimulus is called generalization. So Pavlov conditioned the dog's salivation by using the miniature vibrators, the conditioned stimulus on their thighs. So he had a little thing that would shake their thigh. When he subsequently stimulated other parts of the dog's body, the salivation dropped. So what they can start to do is you can actually start to generalize a stimulus. So not just having the dogs actually drooling over the site of food, now he can actually do it through another thing, through just the vibration in their thigh. So stimulus discrimination. This is when you can discriminate between the stimuli. So discrimination is the learned ability to distinguish between a conditioned stimulus and other stimuli that do not signal the unconditioned stimuli. So if the bell wasn't rang exactly at the right tone, Pavlov's dogs could actually distinguish between the two different tones, and they would know that, oh, that's not when I'm going to actually get my food that I want. So extending Pavlov's understanding, Watson is going to extend it, and we'll look at Watson. But Pavlov and Watson consider the consciousness, our mind, unfit for scientific study. Now, the reason why they don't think they're behaviorists, and behaviorists, remember, like to measure, count things, they like observable behavior, is that the consciousness is more about somebody telling you, and you have to go off somebody's opinion. There's nothing really so measurable about it. So because they're really behaviorists, they like to look at scientific study of psychology. So they only want to associate themselves with things that are measurable, that are countable. So they underestimated the importance of cognitive processes and biological constraints. So when we look at cognitive processes, early behaviors believed that learned behaviors of various animals could be reduced to mindless mechanisms. So they kind of think of animals and people as kind of something that you could just kind of do like almost a machine with, like a computer. Later behaviorists actually suggested that animals learn the predictability of a stimulus, meaning that they learn to expect something, or they're aware of the stimulus. So if you think about it like your dog probably knows about what time you're coming home in the day, or your dog knows that when you go in that one special part of your cabinets in your kitchen, that's where his little biscuits are, and so he gets really excited. So they do expect certain things. Like my dog, he knows that if he's been real good, he's going to get a treat that day, and he gets this treat every day. So biological predisposition. So Pavlov and Watson believed that laws of learning were similar for all animals. Therefore, a pigeon and a person do not differ in their thinking. Now, this is how scientific their thinking gets, is that they believe that animals and people don't really differ in how they actually learn, and they're going to train animals to do this kind of stuff. And Skinner is really the one that's known for training the pigeon. Now, later behaviorists are going to suggest that learning is actually being constrained by an animal's biology. I mean, think about it. A pigeon doesn't speak like a person. They have some sort of language, a bird language that they have with other birds, but it's not a language like humans have. So there is biological constraints on people and on animals. So biological predisposition. So Garcia is another one of these behaviors. So what Garcia does is he lets the little rat here taste something good. So this is the conditioned stimulus. You taste something, it's a delicious little, I don't know, mouse treat. Then he gives him some radiation. So then the radiation is going to be the unconditioned stimulus, and it's going to make the actual rat sick. And then the conditioned response is, he ate that food, he got the radiation treatment, he got sick. So now every time the animal sees that food, they're not going to want it, because the conditioned response is, I ate that and I got sick. So he learned to associate the conditioned stimulus and that conditioned response. So Garcia showed that the duration between the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus may be hours, but yet result in conditioning. So that you don't have to have it within the half a second like Pavlov says. You can actually have it hours later. So a biological adaptive conditioned stimulus, the taste, led to conditioning and not to others like light or sound. Now here's the thing, this is just like some of your parents, okay? If your parents get a phone call in the middle of the day from the teacher, and it's a bad phone call, not the good kind, and then later you get home, then you get your beating, okay? You're going to still associate teacher calls, beating later. And you're going to, hopefully, the next day not do the same behavior, because who wants to get beat every day? So biological predisposition. So even humans can develop classically to conditioned nausea. So you can do an unconditioned stimulus, the drug, and then the unconditioned response would be nausea. So every time you go, like the waiting room, the conditioned stimulus, the unconditioned stimulus will be the drug, and then the unconditioned response is going to be the nausea. Now, if you take out the drug altogether, because every time now you associate the conditioned stimulus, the waiting room, with this conditioned response, nausea. So some people avoid hospitals because they've learned to condition hospitals with something negative, like being sick. So Pavlov's legacy, his greatest contribution to psychology is trying to isolate elementary behaviors from more complex ones through objective scientific procedures. So he does look at stuff in a scientific way. We're going to look at Watson next, but I'm going to stop here, and then we'll move on to part 2 of our learning.